in just a minute or so. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you may be. I just got an email from Hrayr Eulmessekian, who's trying to join the event and failing. Hrayr, can you hear me? Well, there's always some technical problem somewhere. I hope we get them resolved for everybody who is trying to join us. There he is. I see Hrayr Eulmessekian has made it. That's very good. I can proceed with a clean conscience now. We can start then. And my name is Marc Nichanian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. And I'd like to just make a couple of brief announcements before we get the program underway. We have a large number of events of NASR programs coming up over the next couple of months, and I won't take the time to enumerate them all, but will instead just specifically mention the next program, which is Sunday, October 31st at 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. It's the international book launch of Kate Franklin's Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, Living the Silk Road in Medieval Armenia. This is co-sponsored by NASR and the Armenian Institute in London, presenting an important new work of scholarship and also, I think, a very interesting one, and we hope you can join us for that. Please get on our email list or follow us on social media for timely announcements of all upcoming events. I want to thank our friend Vahe Oshagan and the Hamaskain Armenian Educational and Cultural Society Boston chapter for their collaboration on this program today and their willingness to wait it out through the various complications that have beset the planning of the event. What do I mean by this? Well, this program was originally planned for April 2nd, 2020 as an in-person event at NASR, or at least partly in person. About a month before that, of course, COVID shut down NASR and most of the rest of the world. Once we were up and running with online events, we planned to have the program in that format, which we are currently doing. And it was scheduled for October 7th, 2020. About 10 days before that, the 44-day war began, and it seemed not exactly the right moment as everyone's attention was understandably focused elsewhere. It's a little hard, therefore, not to be paranoid, but 1 year later, here we are, and so far, nothing catastrophic has happened today that I've been made aware of. The war is hardly over. The war is over, but the crisis caused by the war is hardly past, and we are left to wrestle with questions of what does it all mean, and now what, and what even matters anymore. We're left with, to steal a phrase from Frank O'Hara, meditations in an emergency. Or as Vahe Oshagan says in the film we are going to talk about today, I try to bring some sort of conciliation between literature and politics. It's very difficult, he adds. And I guess we will talk about that today as well. Maybe this is still the wrong time for us to turn to Vahe Oshagan and his work, or maybe it's very much the right time. You can decide for yourselves. The audience has had the opportunity to view Hrayr Eulmessekian's documentary Vahe Oshagan Between Acts, which provides the point of departure for today's discussion. The film infuses the traditional documentary with visual, sound, text, and scholarly interpretations of Oshagan's poetry and prose. It features readings and commentary by Oshagan himself, as well as analysis by well-known critics such as Krikor Beledian, Krikor Chahinian, and Marc Nichanian, and electronic compositions by Ohannes Salibian. We have with us today the filmmaker himself, Hrayr Eulmessekian, please wave, joining us from Los Angeles, and two additional panelists extremely well qualified to provide further insights into the life and work of Vahe Oshagan. Dr. Taline Voskeritchian up the road from me in Belmont, Mass., and Dr. Karen Jallatyan up the road from me in Budapest, Hungary. The audience is invited to submit questions during the program or after the program using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom, and we will get to them after they give their presentations. Brief introductions to our panel. Hrayr Eulmessekian was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and attended the Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts. French, not my first language. He moved to San Francisco in 1984 and received BFA and MFA degrees from the San Francisco Art Institute. His works have been exhibited, screened, or broadcast in the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York, Yerevan, Dubai, and other places around the world, including on YouTube, obviously, which means everywhere. He is the guest editor of Art East Quarterly, 2014 spring issue. He was the subject of a featured interview by Professor Marc Nichanian, and his work was reviewed by Dr. Anahit Kasabian. Both were published in GAM Review number 6. His recent translation of Arthur C. Danto's seminal work, The End of Art, into Western Armenian was published in GAM 7. A founding member of the San Francisco Armenian Film Festival, he has served on its curatorial team, and he lives in Los Angeles, as mentioned. Taline Voskeritchian is a writer and translator from Armenian and Arabic. Her PhD is from the University of Iowa, and she teaches at Boston University. She has translated Hagop Oshagan, Vahe Oshagan, Krikor Beledian, and Mahmoud Darwish, among others. Her prose has appeared in local, national, and international literary and cultural reviews. She has taught writing and literature in Beirut, Los Angeles, Boston, Yerevan, and Ramallah to inner city, high school, college, and continuing education students. She is currently preparing with Christopher Millis a volume of selections from Krikor Beledian's writings, which will be the first such project in English, and she is working on a historical novel. Karen Jallatyan obtained a comparative literature PhD from UC Irvine in 2019. His dissertation analyzes the works of the filmmaker Garine Torosyan and writers Vahe Oshagan and Krikor Beledian to argue that each in their own way paves the way for Armenian diasporic becoming. During the 2019 and 2020 academic year, Dr. Jallatyan was a Manoogian postdoctoral fellow in Armenian studies at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and for the past year, he has been teaching in the Department of Armenian Studies at the Catholic University in Budapest. Dr. Jallatyan's research, while focusing specifically on Vahe Oshagan, also looks broadly into diaspora Armenian artistic production, situating it within ongoing critical theoretical debates. We have a great group of people to talk today, and I would like to first turn to the filmmaker, Hrayr.
Thank you, Mark, again. Thank you very much for your continued belief in this event, and as you mentioned, to everything that went on with the other schedulings. And I would like also to thank Nasser and Hamas Kain for the support. I'm going to give a very brief background on how this film came through and came to me first, because it wasn't something that that I was expecting to do. It happened, and when I got a phone call back in 1994 from Vahe Oshagan and Hrayr Eulmessekian, asking me if I'd be interested to put together a slideshow type of biographical slideshow, kind of put to narration, because at the time the community had recently discovered broadcast media, and video was becoming more and more accessible to more this kind of projects. And the reason why they wanted me to do the slideshow was because that year there were going to be celebrations, jubilee celebrations of Vahé Oshagan's work throughout the communities, Armenian communities on the planet. So I immediately said accepted, of course, because it was a challenging work. But I also there was this other aspect that Vahé Oshagan and I had moved to San Francisco the same year, in 1984, the Orwellian year, and him coming, Arseniy Wenger coming to take over the Armenian school, to be the principal of the Armenian school, and Vahe Oshagan was going to start teaching at Berkeley Extension. And Maral and I had come to San Francisco to run away from the Armenian community. So we didn't want to move to Los Angeles, and we stayed there. We had seen in our experiences coming from Lebanon, we had lived through the first 10 years of the civil war, and among other things, the Lebanese civil war is also an identity crisis of the different sects, the different Lebanese communities. So and San Francisco, if you want to exile yourself, is one of the best places to do on the planet. And so Vahe and I knew each other. We met at the Church Bazaar that same year, and we continued our conversations for 10 years, and I really was looking forward to working on this film. One other reason why I think the project came to me was because we had already started doing community television. We would send 15-minute segments to Los Angeles, to the Horizon program, and they would send us back. We would broadcast. So I had all the equipment to work with. But I have also to say that Vahe and I did not always see things eye to eye. San Francisco is also, other than being one of the first places that experimental film started, was also known, probably still is, for its conceptual art. So, and Vahe's work is very much into more existential and East European, and San Francisco is more Eastern in a way, Zen that kind of sensitivity. So but we continued our conversations. By the time they had called me for the film, they had already moved to Australia. So what we decided to expand and not stick to the slideshow format. So we put together questions and we sent them to everybody that we wanted them to all the commentators. And at the time, before the internet, that was very limited. Everything had to be done by snail mail and telephone calls. And so we lucked out. We only had I was given 2.5 months, to put the film together. The majority of the material came through, and the other, and I should also mention that I had heard that Ohannes Salibian, the late Ohannes composer, had worked with Vahe's work. I was there when he was working around that same time, so I had heard he was doing that. So I contacted him, and he immediately sent me the tapes, the audio tapes that he had done that you hear in the film, both raw recordings and his work, the compositions. And so the and we I kind of I still can't remember how that we that everything came together. There is one thing I have to say, that there are three versions of this film. The first version, Krikor Beledian, is not in the first version because his tape arrived the day of the Jubilee commemoration. The people at the post office across the street knew me. I would stop by there to see whether it had arrived for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and that day when the event was going to be held in Los Angeles, that's the day when the tape arrived. So the second version I reworked in 2006 with Krikor Beledian, which is pretty much the same film that you see today. And the third version, of course, is with the subtitles with Taline. And I knew Taline had translated Vahe Oshagan's work, especially Tebigyang. And I have a longer version of, I had the full version of Tebigyang that I worked a year later, and I used that when we were screening the film independently, which is the same intervention, the same layering, but the whole poem. It's about 25 minutes. So we had, I think it took us about 10 years, Taline, to find funding for this version. And Gulbenkian and Razmik Panosyan immediately came through when we sent them the proposal, and so we finished the third version with the subtitles, with a lot of also the technical updates. Because now in the digital world, we can do a lot of that. People who've seen the film know that Krikor Beledian's footage is really, really all over the place. The camera work is jumping all over the place. And believe me, I did a lot of stabilization content with the method that's available today. But it came, and then in 2016, this is the film that we have. We opened it in Yerevan first, and then we've been around. This was supposed to be the last screening before we send it, made it public on YouTube. So now that I'm going to go back, I can answer all other questions later on. I probably am running too long on this. I want to go back to what Marc said about whether cultural restarting culture and artistic life is in this day and age, in our times, is warranted. I witnessed that 3 years into the Lebanese civil war, most cultural and artistic events stopped, and everybody, most in the Armenian community too, but all over the Lebanon, but most artists, writers, and you can see in the film, Vahé Oshagan left in 1975. And it was kind of, the community did not recover from that war. And I don't know if this is going to be the same thing, but but the culture and art itself is extremely important to continue. The other thing is that with the events of last year, and this is me talking, we were not where we thought we were in our imaginaries, and at this point, I don't think we know where we're going. I also heard on YouTube somewhere that like we should weaponize our culture. I disagree completely with that. If we weaponize the culture, we won't have a culture, and we won't have a weapon. The place of the art or the artist is not to find solutions, but to create more problems. And I hope, and I think Vahé is still creating problems for us. And, again, before I hand it over to Taline, and I had I had this in mind, and I'm really one of the reasons why I was excited that we were going to have the last event in Boston was that I want to dedicate this film to Ohannes Salibian's memory, the late composer, Taline's husband. Without his generosity, I mean, we were friends. We talked every Sunday almost, or every other Sunday. We would talk shop, we would talk art, we would talk literature, we would talk music, film, all kinds of stuff. And I dearly miss him. I think we all do. And with that, I hand it to Taline.
Thank you. Thank you, Hrayr. And thank you for dedication. I don't think I should be the one to thank you, but I'm the only one around from this house, so I have to do it. And also, this year is the 100th anniversary of Vahe Oshagan's birth. So this is a special occasion, and thank you again. My task is to sort of to do something which I don't usually do, and that is to say why I think this film is important, and more than important, why it is a breakthrough phenomenon. It is a film that has no precedent to begin with. It has no real context, and it has no forefathers and foremothers in our culture. By that I mean that, first of all, it is in Armenian. Hagop Gulijian says we must use Armenian, and I will say Armenian, but I mean Western Armenian. And it is about an Armenian writer and a public intellectual. There is Armenian poetry in it. So it's all Armenian. And the comments are also in Armenian. So it's a totally Armenian film, which in itself, I think, has no precedent, at least that I know of. Now, the irony is that we're talking about it in English, but we know what the irony is, so we'll just continue. But also, I think it is a film, I don't know what word to use except the word native, and I don't mean it in the way in which it is used, but the material here is native material. By that, I mean that it is national material. It is in Armenian, it is by an Armenian, the filmmaker is Armenian, everything is Armenian, and yet it is an experimental documentary. So I think to begin with, there is an interesting clash here between material that is close to the national spirit or the national psyche, and something which is very far from Armenian film practices. The films that I know are all films that are shackled by certain themes that keep coming up in the making of Armenian films. I don't want to talk more about it because I think we know what we're talking about. So I think the film does something interesting in that it brings these two things together, an experimental spirit and material which we have carried with us in the diaspora from place to place for centuries. So, and I think in a way, the film is very faithful to Vahe Oshagan's purpose, in that it pushes two things that don't go together with each other, to each other. And in the case of Vahe Oshagan's poetry, what I mean by that is that the poetry itself, the language itself is Armenian, but the sensibility, the settings, the urban realities are all, as the film tells us, are all from elsewhere. And in that regard, he is a modernist. So that's one way in which the film is an innovation. The other one is that I think what Hrayr has done is he has taken he has infused word with sound, with image. And I don't know of any other film that does this in this way. So there is the poetry, there is the sound, and there is the image. And so what we have is, in a way, a total work, a complete work with at least three artistic practices. So in that regard, I think it is a groundbreaking film. And I think that is the defining quality of the film. Now, I want to take these, what I just said, and put them in the context of our work, Hrayr and my work, which is the translation part. Yes, we worked many years on this, too many years, I think. And the way we worked was, Hrayr, one day he called me and he said, do you want to do the subtitles of this film? And I said, what do you mean subtitles? And I thought, it's just going to be subtitles. But basically it ended up being a literary translation, which was extremely pleasurable and enjoyable, but it was also quite difficult, as you can imagine. I did the first and the second translations, drafts, and then the final draft, Hrayr and I worked on together, which was the one that took the longest time. And so this is a collaboration between Hrayr and myself, and I want to mention that because I think it's important that we praise collaborative work. We Armenians, we don't like that tradition very much, but this is very much of a collaboration between Hrayr and myself. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to do the translation so that it would become accessible to large audiences. Now, the problems we faced or the difficulties we faced, some of them are the traditional difficulties. And by that, I mean the use of vulgar language or vernacular language in Vahé Oshagan's poetry, which is kind of like an intervention. It comes out of nowhere, the vulgarity. Of course, we have traditions of Allen Ginsberg and other poets who have done this. So that was not as much of a problem or as difficult as the second thing which I'm going to mention, and that is, and I'll probably conclude with this, there is a word in Armenian, hefk. I don't think there is an English translation for the word hefk. If there is, someone can tell me. It is the panting, when you pant. There is in all of Vahé Oshagan's texts, there is a panting, there is a kind of hefk. Tebigyank, there is always a movement towards something, but one never reaches that something. Now, I know that Ohannes was very much taken by this quality in the poetry, and that's why he wanted to put it to sound. So the hardest part, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hrayr, but I think the hardest part was to begin to create that sense of rhythm, but it's a nervous rhythm. It's an anxiety rhythm. To create that both in the translation itself, but also to make it fit at the bottom of the screen. We had great difficulty with that. So that, for me, was the most complicated and difficult. I don't like the word challenge, but it's challenge. Let's go with challenge. A challenge, and I think to a large degree we were supported in that by both the writer's voice, Vahé Oshagan's voice, which has that quality, and also by the music, and also by the images, the throb, the constant throb. I hadn't realized it until I watched it again this morning, that it's there. I think I will stop here because I think my 10 minutes are up, Mark, yes? I think so, yeah. I will stop and I will pass my turn to Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank Marc Nichanian and Nasser for this opportunity.
Oh yeah, thank you, Marc.
and from Taline as well. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to participate and to do my best to contribute. So I will first begin by talking a little bit about aspects of Vahé Oshagan's contribution that are less emphasized by the film. Not to say that the film has limitations, but it's just one film, and Vahé Oshagan has other kinds of contributions I think that are worth mentioning. So first, I would like to mention that from the 1960s onwards, Vahe Oshagan publishes in a very systematic and in a regular manner literary criticism. They appear first in the Bagin periodical, later in Astag, Young Armenian, Yerdasart Hay, and Ahegan. And these works, the texts that appear in these publications are very diverse. They introduce and discuss works of publications by Sartre, Beckett, Faulkner, Camus, Jean Cocteau, but also from the Armenian side, Axel Baguns, Charens, Shahnur, Krikor Zorab, Hagop Oshagan, and the list goes on and on. From the 1970s and 80s onwards, Vahe Oshagan does something very important. He actually discusses, critiques, and presents the poets from Soviet Armenia that come after Bayur-Sevak. And I'm talking about poets like Razmik Tavoyan or Hendrik Edoyan. And in my opinion, this series of articles that he writes are great contributions for a sort of like diaspora, Soviet Armenia cultural dialogue. They are very serious attempts to grapple with a new kind of Soviet Armenian poetry that is being written, let's say, in the 70s and 80s. In addition to this, Vahe Oshagan has about, if I remember correctly, about 9 articles on theater, just discussing theater, Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and other plays. But also, as many of you might know, Vahe Oshagan has also works of theater himself. The most striking ones to me are the Dysfunctional Elevator, Khangarvats Verelaga, and Avaraish 80, Avarar Utsun. And I hope I'm waiting for the day to come when this plays will actually be staged somewhere in the Armenian diaspora or even in Armenia. Vahe Oshagan has also played an important role in initiating Hagop Oshagan studies. Being, of course, the son of Hagop Oshagan, he very much supported the publication of the Panorama of Western Armenian Literature, produced by Hagop Oshagan. He also, as I know, and as Marc Nichanian has spoken many times, he also urged thinkers like Marc Nichanian to research Hagop Oshagan, and this is in the 60s and in the 70s. In addition to some of the works that were already mentioned in the film by Hrayr, Vahe Oshagan also has an unpublished series of historical novels. The broad title for them is Hervandan, or Premonitory in English. And out of this series, Vahe Oshagan has pretty much completed the first 2 volumes. And the series itself makes an arc of the Armenian experience, particularly in the Ottoman world, around the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, around the time when revolutionary modernist ideas about nationhood and freedom were creeping into the Ottoman Empire, to the French Revolution, to the Greek War of Independence, and affecting, of course, Armenian communities and Armenian agents, different kinds of agents of different social classes, etc. This work is particularly interesting because it infuses Vahe Oshagan's existentialist absurdist preoccupations with the genre of a historical novel. And in my opinion, in a very interesting way, it diasporizes the past, which Armenians tend to read in a very conventional national terms. So as a historical novel, I think it's a very unique kind of work of fiction. In the 1980s, Vahe Oshagan started contributing to the Aspares Gragan Chronic column, almost on a weekly basis. As far as I know, he has about 500 texts published into the Aspares, which were also republished in Literary Horizon, appearing from Montreal. And Vahe Oshagan was very creative in terms of inventing sub-themes and series of articles about books, women writers, a series about Armenian press, also in a sense showcasing his great erudition. about the Armenian past, especially on what pertains to culture and literature. All right, so these are various aspects of Oshagan work that I think are extremely important for us to mention. Now I'll turn in the time that rests for me and say a few things about the work that is being done around Vahé Oshagan now. The first thing to be mentioned is the volume Kayanner, Stations, which appeared in 2007. It's an anthology put together, prepared and edited by Krikor Beledian. And a few significant things about this volume is the fact that it publishes in its entirety Oshagan's groundbreaking volume of poetry, City. You have the entire volume here. And in addition to that, it also has unpublished works appearing for the first time, notable among them being the Nor Padarak, New Mass, which is another existentialist, iconoclastic, theological work of theater about Armenian diasporic experience. So in addition to Krikor Beledian, who has contributed a number of essays in this volume, there's also, of course, Marc Nichanian, who has written a lot about Vahe Oshagan. And recently in GAM 8, the periodical GAM 8, Marc Nichanian basically contributed the first half of the volume to different kinds of texts about Vahe Oshagan, also by Oshagan. And this is where I can talk a little bit more about my work. I was fortunate enough to publish an essay in GAM 8 about Oshagan's poetry, where I try to both mention the kinds of readings that have been done around his poetry by Beledian and Nichanian. And these readings are, you can get a taste of these readings by watching the film, because these two important critics talk about Vahe Oshagan. But in my own essay, I try to read Oshagan's very itinerant literary life, having lived in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, in Beirut, as a form of archiving the Armenian diaspora. In almost all senses of the archive, starting from a very basic material sense of archive, books, Oshagan's books, Vahe Oshagan's books are published in New York, in Philadelphia, in Beirut. He has published early on poetry in Paris. So literally, his literary contribution is almost a map of the 20th century diaspora Armenian cultural communal existence. But I try to read Oshagan from hopefully fresh perspectives by bringing in thinkers such as Gilles Deleuze and trying to start a debate about what is known in the critical theoretical circles as new materialism, where we try to not just talk about discourse and ideology and poetry, but try to connect with the lived time and temporal and spatial experience of what I think should be considered as Armenian diasporic becoming. In addition to these works, I'm hoping to write a book which would probably be the first book fully written about Vahe Oshagan, hopefully first in English. That book should pretty much lay as much foundation as possible regarding himself, Vahe Oshagan as a figure, which as Taline already mentioned, as an extremely sensitive modernist poet, almost in line with T.S. Eliot and Allen Ginsberg, but also someone who in a very daring manner attacks, displaces, destroys Western Armenian national literature inherited from the previous generation. Why? For the sake of diaspora as a creative opportunity. So I want to end on this note by saying that for Oshagan, diaspora was a way of making culture, and was a creative moment. And I think we should remember this. This should be our starting point, basically, when we think about Vahe Oshagan as a poet and as a modernist writer and a critic. Thank you.
Thank you all for your remarks. We will now, again, we welcome your questions. Use the Zoom Q&A, actually, rather than the chat, which I think is what people have used so far, just so everything is in one place. But we have a question here on the chat from Khachi Dergulkasian for Taline. Let me make this a little bit larger. Vahé Oshagan was very committed to diaspora as the continuity of Western Armenian culture and identity. He writes, why not remembering him specifically as a Western Armenian writer rather than as a more broadly Armenian writer? I have two arguments to justify my request of remembering Vahé as a Western Armenian writer. First, this was very much his singularity. He was, with Beledian, mostly the creator of a diaspora language or legitimizing the diaspora Western Armenian. Second, Western Armenian writers are a species in danger. This is directed to Taline, but of course I would invite Karen and Hrayr to address the question as well and the comments that it contains.
Shall I?
Yes, please.
I thought I mentioned both. I thought I said Western Armenian, and I stuck to Armenian there was no, I mean, I wasn't making a point, but I want to say something about, for many, many years, we always said Armenian. We never, this notion of Western Armenian is a the phrase itself is a relatively new phrase. If I am wrong, I'd like to be corrected. But when I was growing up with my uncle, Vahe Oshagan, we talked of Armenian as Hayren. We didn't say Arev Meda Hayren as a specific thing different from Arevela Hayren. I don't remember that. If it is so, then of course I mean Western Armenian. So this is the first thing. The second thing is that, yes, I agree that what the gentleman says, that he is trying very much to continue the tradition of the diaspora literature and the diaspora existence, which Karen alluded to in his remarks. I am not sure I see the impetus of the question. I agree with what the gentleman is saying.
Well, for one thing, I would take, I want to bring this, I have it on my desk. It's the conversation, the diasporan conversation started probably in the 1960s as a viable alternative. And I have this Ports Darakutian Masin Hartun Krikjan, who was, I believe, most likely also Khachik's teacher back in Jemaran. So one thing I also want to because it's not directly related to what Khachik is asking, but since the subject came up, for me, when these things were happening, I was barely a teenager, not even a teenager. But this bustling cultural life had started in Beirut, in Armenian, and a conversation with very little conversation with the Lebanese, by the way, which is interesting.
Except for Ahegan.
Except for Ahegan. And but for me, when I took on the project, it immediately came back to me that there was this, in my life, there was this huge gap that I wanted to connect with what we had left in early 70s Lebanese art, literature, and especially theater. The theater played a major role in Beirut. And but also with everything that Hartun Krikjan and Krikor Chahinian and their generation, Ahegan basically was edited by Krikor Chahinian, who is in the film, and he also was our teacher, by the way. So that's one thing that I wanted to do, is try to reconnect with what I thought was missing with the in the culture, because once you live the Middle East and move to the United States, it's a completely different landscape, cultural landscape. I mean, I remember seeing my first impressionist paintings, and I really started liking them when I saw the real ones. I never liked the original, the reprints. But that's what our connections were back then with the Western culture.
If I may add a remark, which I actually just thought about now, I think we can divide perhaps the, let's say, the cultural life of Beirut, the Armenian cultural life in Beirut, into two main phases. And Vahé Oshagan is the one who pushes for a transition to the second one. The main one is, of course, a post-catastrophic generation who is trying to, let's call it, recover its communities. But of course, this recovery, which is very much centered around Western Armenian in a very monolingual sense. And as we know, many Armenians who are speaking Turkish, many survivors who are speaking Turkish, or their parents, grandparents who are only speaking Turkish, they start speaking Turkish and they start speaking Western Armenian. And then we have poets like Musha Ishkhan and many others who were conceiving of communal life in a very conventional national sense. So that happens in the until, let's say, 1950s and 60s. Of course, it continues to happen in many ways. But then the figure of Vahé Oshagan is important because he, having studied in Paris in the 40s and late 40s and early 50s, having smelled in the air the figure of Sartre as the public intellectual of France, who was willing to be iconoclastic and provocative and speak forth uncomfortable things. So he comes to Beirut and he pushes for another kind of Armenian communal belonging, which is more of a diasporic kind, which wants to emphasize the diasporic aspect of things and wants to shift Western Armenian literature, which has been in the first phase reimagined and created as a national kind of entity, even outside of historic Armenia, as diasporic. So I would situate Oshagan in the middle of that transition as someone who self-consciously, or maybe in some respects not very self-consciously, pushes for that transition.
Thank you. We have a profound question from Arseniy Oshagan. If Vahé Oshagan were here today, what question would you wish to pose to him?
I have one question in my mind immediately. I could pose that question. Perhaps it could be, well, it will be in the style of Vahé Oshagan because he didn't, he was not afraid to be provocative and contradictory. What I would ask him, and this appears a little bit in the film when he talks about Dashnakzutun, I would ask Vahé Oshagan about the way he straddled the contradictions between being a member of the Dashnakzutun party, the Armenian Revolutionary Party, and a very dedicated and committed member in the best possible sense of the word. That means that he was willing to also criticize the ARF for its shortcomings. At the same time, he tried to experiment with this grand diasporic kind of vision that in so many ways didn't quite correspond to the political party and to its vision. So I would ask him to talk a little bit about that, about being in that space full of tension, full of contradiction, to what extent he liked it, he provoked it, he wanted it to happen, and to what extent it was inevitable perhaps for him. It's a question that I ask about myself, to myself.
Well, Arseniy, thank you for that question. Thank you, but it's a hellish question, as you know. I think if I'm not going to ask a personal question, then the question in my mind, my second question would be, the place of Armenia in his work. And how, again, the idea of straddling the contradiction between being a diaspora writer with very much of a diaspora sensibility, and yet writing a work, Fatherland, which is, what shall we say, which praises, even glorifies, the homeland. And I would ask him that question. I would not want an answer. I would want to know what kinds of issues did that bring up for him? Because I think that is the second fundamental contradiction in his work. The first being the one you just mentioned, Karen, and I think this is the second one. That's what I think. Especially these days when the homeland is, I've thought about that. I've asked myself many times over the past year, what would my uncle think? What would he say? How would he feel?
Yeah. Is it my turn to?
Yes, unless you already asked him all of the questions.
I mentioned this when we were in Yerevan during the first screening. I was hoping that he hadn't left Lebanon, and he had intervened in the had he not left Lebanon. Now it's too late for that anyway. But how he would have seen the evolvement of things, diaspora, and after the independence and the connection with, because I remember after their first visit to Armenia, they came through San Francisco, and he said, and I have this interview online, it is in Armenian, and I remember him saying that the Republic has the right to do anything they want to do, which was a departure from, again, what he stood for before and what Karen and Taline are raising as questions. Actually, one thing I regret that we never had this conversation together after I made the film. And because, again, we continued on phone calls when they moved back to Philadelphia. But I would say, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I would ask him, but I wish he was around to write his columns every week.
Yeah.
And guide and bring and continue the conversation, because one thing that is extremely important to remember, that everybody thought, artists, writers, everybody, visual artists, people in the visual arts, everybody had, what would Vahé say? That was in everybody's mind. What would Vahé say about this work, that work, or this event or that event?
Yes, and I would like to add a point, if I may, and that is that I think I'm glad this has been brought up by both Karen and Hrayr, because we really don't have a critical culture to speak of. I mean, I think Vahe Oshagan was by himself created a context for works to be talked about, to be discussed, to be analyzed, to be through his criteria, of course. Now we don't have it. We have press releases. We have long pieces of praise about books and works of art. We have interviews galore, but we don't have a critical, we don't even have a critical journal.
No, we don't have a...
We had in Lebanon. And I think in this, if I'm one more point, in this transition from Lebanon to the United States, we have lost this. Because we had the beginnings of it in Lebanon,
yes,
in the 60s and the 70s, and with this migration, this wave of migration to the United States, we somehow lost it. We don't have it. We need to rebuild it from scratch, almost.
No, definitely, and we talk with within ourselves that we have a lack of institutions, but we also forget that institutions alone are not only are not enough. I mean, we lack cultural accountability. Things happen, they fade, they're gone, nobody talks about, nobody analyzes, nobody, there is no critique session, internal critique session, like Taline was saying. And Vahé, in himself, was with his 500 Kragan chroniques, was doing that. I read the Saturday paper only for Vahe Oshagan Asparez. That's it.
I wanted to quickly go back to the question of the relationship between Armenia and diaspora by mentioning again these articles that he wrote on the post, let's say, Bar Sevak poets from Soviet Armenia. Remember, this is the 70s and 80s. No one imagines Soviet Armenia or the Soviet Union to fall apart and Armenia to become independent. But already in these articles, Vahé Oshagan, he uses the term, if memory serves, something like the earth on which they walk, Armenians who live on the earth, on the land, gives them a special kind of privilege, special kind of right, which is different from his self-avowed and of course the broader diasporic experience. So he's willing to grant something special to the Armenian, Eastern Armenian, Soviet Armenian culture as different, as a nation state, as grounded and territorial. So that one might think that, okay, Vahé Oshagan privileges the nation state, but immediately around the time when Armenia becomes independent, Vahé Oshagan ends up having this sort of like somewhat unpleasant debate within the pages of the ARF. And when he declares that diaspora also needs to be independent now that Armenia is independent, great. The time has come for the Armenian diaspora to also be independent. And of course, the ARF, some columnists, some writers from the ARF, they lash against Vahé Oshagan, saying that now that finally the Soviet Armenia is passed and we have an independent state, now you speak about independent diaspora. So once again, we see one pull towards allowing the privilege of a nation state, territorial, et cetera, monolingual. And then on the other hand, again, with the same figure of Vahé Oshagan, we have the other direction. And that's the beauty of Vahé Oshagan, or his ability to straddle these contradictions and to, in a sense, push them to their creative extremes for the sake of, for a cultural existence, both diasporic and national, that is legitimate in its own right. And I think it's a very important point for us to understand in terms of trying to make sense of the Armenian life, which is both diasporic and nation state centered. And Vahé Oshagan, I think, is a good example of how to do that with all of his contradictions, of course.
So I'd like to pose this question, which may continue this line of inquiry from Karen Jallatyan, saying Vahé was ahead of his time in thinking as a diasporan. For him, it was a world of its own. What sustained this thinking apart from concern about the then Soviet rule in Armenia? I imagine probably that has numerous answers, but maybe Karen can start.
Yes, I would like to start. First and foremost, the word that comes to my mind is that of culture. And this alludes to what Hrayr, you said about weaponizing culture, not weaponizing culture in your critical statement. Vahé Oshagan believed that culture, at least in its diasporic shape and form, did not need to be territorial, did not necessarily need to have a nation state. And in fact, it was such an interesting moment for him to think and to try to create such a culture. So on the one hand, he was willing to look into the past and historicize Armenian experiences in so many different ways, but he emphasized the novelty and the emergent nature of diaspora. So the word is culture, or as was the other phrase I would mention was debispurk or debigyank, toward the diaspora. As for how that culture manifests or articulates itself for us, certainly it is going to be different from what it was for Vahé Oshagan. But I think it's our duty to understand at least how he tried to experiment with diasporic culture production, In what ways did he try to think of it as a modern enterprise? In what kinds of cultural currency borrowed from and was inspired by, be it existentialism or Anglophone poetry, literature in general, etc., etc. So the one word for me is culture.
In many ways, this experience, this Armenian experience, the hybridity issue that comes up in contemporary cultural thing. I think Khachik Tololian is probably with us. Maybe he can comment or say something. I think Vahé Oshagan managed to live in all the cultures, but mainly in Western Armenian. And hybridity for me has this notion of being able, to be able to function completely in each culture. And then, we make transitions between them, going back and forth, but also being able to function completely in each of the cultures.
I would like to share the comment rather than question from Khachik Tololian. Vahé was a pivotal figure in the transition from Aksor and Darakrutun to Spurk, or as he puts it in his scholarly work, from exile to diaspora nationalism to transnationalism. Vahé's other was Antonik Zarukian and Harutun Kirkchan's essays were also important contributions to this transition. This transition happened at different times in Paris, Marseille versus Halep, Istanbul, diaspora or not versus Beirut, etc. Would anyone care to?
There was another transition, which is a very important transition. It doesn't have to do with continents and countries and cultures. It has to do with when things. Harutun Kirkchan's essay. Let me try to translate this. Okay, there was. Second. It is kind of recounting the 1968 student movements in Paris. It's happening during then. So there's this other world, there's a pre-68 world connecting with the post-68 world. And everything that changed also in the United States, in England and in Europe mainly, that were kind of slowly being, getting into the Armenian culture. In the Middle East, we forget that Lebanon also was bustling with this kind of cultural events and work, and so that's another transition that generation brought. The pre-68, post-68 way of looking at things.
I would like to comment on Khachik Tololian's remarkable phrase by noting how Khachik Tololian already notes that diasporic becoming, as I would like to call it, is very differential. In other words, Paris, Istanbul, Halep, they can be living in different worlds almost, different stages of seeing themselves as diasporic, of transitioning from a national way of looking at things. What is interesting about Vahé Oshagan is that he manages to connect this by his own experience. Already born in Bulgaria, grew up in Jerusalem, Cyprus, with Krikor Oshagan, studied in Paris, wrote, published, taught in Beirut, etc., Philadelphia, Australia, San Francisco, but also in his works. For example, if we take the third, if I'm not mistaken, the third and very important volume, Crossroads, Rachmeruk, in it he has the Beirut Paris, the poem, where he basically, the first thing he says is that the road from Beirut to Paris does not pass through Armenia, it passes through the roads of humanity. Point number one. So just quickly saying that the nation state, forget about the nation state for now. second, he says that if you want to be a diasporic, if you want to own up to your diasporic condition, you have to try to be as creative as you can in tandem with humanity. And that work, by the way, Hrayr, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it signed the signature, the author signatures from 1968, right when Paris was exploding through the anti-capitalistic, anti-traditionalist rebellions, and I'm sure some waves of it arrived to Beirut through Vahe Oshagan and through other figures.
Overall, Lebanon was.
Yeah.
Everything, the student movements also happened in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
Different contexts, different issues there, because Lebanon is not an industrialized country, still is not. But the similar issues of the generation having, wanting to question everything that was being taught to them and rebelling against.
Yes.
And,
I also want to, yes, please.
Right. That was the first, Beirut Paris was the first work that Ohannes put to sound.
Yeah.
And I remember it was done in Beirut in our living room with scotch tape and razor blades.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an incredible poem, and it's a beautiful. There are 3 poems that have been put to sound: Beirut Paris, Tebigyang, and Ahazang. And they are at different stages of Vahé Oshagan's life.
Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, all of them are present in the film, at least 2 of them.
I think all of them are present.
All of them, yeah.
Yes, parts of all of them, from all of them, are used for the film, yes. And of course, we also have to remember that there was the anti-Vietnam War movement and the civil rights movement in the United States. So Oshagan as a figure Vahé Oshagan has to be put in the middle of these developments, and as responding and both responding to them, but also bringing some of their inspirations into Western Armenian letters.
Yes.
Let me mention that if anybody watching has not actually seen the film, it is available on YouTube. I posted the link in the chat. It's also linked on the event page on the Nasser website for this program. And certainly, if you haven't watched it yet, you should watch it. You should watch it now. So I'd kind of like to, maybe by way of conclusion, bring it full circle, and maybe the question I would ask him, but I will ask it to the 3 of you instead, is what, and this isn't to assume there's a singular answer to this, obviously, what does Vahé Oshagan's work say to us at this particular time of national crisis?
Who's going to take that one?
You all are.
As I said, we don't know at this point. My initial, and I wrote this to friends in emails, that we are not where we were not where we thought we were, and we don't know where we're going. How to proceed from here? That would be my question. How to proceed? What to do to proceed from here? That would be my question. Culturally, that is. I'm not talking about politics. I don't want to get into the culture. Culturally, there's a lot to be done. A lot to be done. Starting from the whole cultures, first world cultures have ecosystems. We don't have one. They have institutions, publications, newspapers, museums, education systems. There's none of that. And all kinds of critical thinking that culture brings into the realm, and into the and what culture can see things on intervenes in realities of today. We don't have those interventions. We're still probably in shock, and a lot of there's cultural shock, but also we are still in shocks from the events of last year. So what to do to get out of that shock, and what can culture bring into that?
As Taline is thinking, I think maybe I can say a few things. I think, Taline, you mentioned the critical aspect of Vahé Oshagan as a figure. I think one thing that we can learn as a culture, whether we call it national, post-national, transnational, as a culture, as an Armenian culture, with all of its diversity, is to be more honest and more critical about our shortcomings. One of the results of not being honest and open and critical about our shortcomings, one can argue, is the war and its consequences. All of the dreaming and all of the miscalculation, one may think, that went with it. But I also, the second point that I want to make about Vahé Oshagan is that with him we have someone who, in his time and in his way, was able to make Western Armenian letters extremely relevant and in pace with its times. We mentioned in 1968, the 68 movements and the existentialism, post-war existentialism. So all of these things are happening in the world. There are major events in cultural, intellectual lives, and Vahé Oshagan's work reflects on them in its own way. So as a culture, it is our duty as people who want to have cultures, as who think we have culture, who strive to have culture, is our duty to keep up with the times, to make Western Armenian letters again relevant with the times in a critical way. And that could be the best response to all the challenges that we're faced as a nation state and as a culture in general. So critical and keeping up with the times. Those are the two main terms for, in my mind, that we see in a very beautiful way playing out in Vahé Oshagan's contributions over the second half and the entirety of the second half of the 20th century, basically.
Yeah, I think his relevance is that he took the material culture of the diaspora seriously. He took it as the raw material of his work. I am thinking of the poem Baron Veresh, which is a remarkable poem about a Baron Veresh in Beirut. And things like this. There are other examples. There are examples in the short stories and in the poetry. In the short stories more so, especially in Odzum, it's all there. And I think that is, if we take it seriously, if we take our conditions seriously, if we take our material seriously, then we can ask the questions. But I don't think we do, because our gaze is always all the time to the homeland. And if the gaze is all the time to the homeland, then there is no, we only have two eyes. There is no place for what is close to us, what is near us. And in that regard, I think I want to come back to Hrayr's film. I think the film is also important because it is about an Armenian in the diaspora. And I often ask myself, for instance, why has no one made a film about other figures in the diaspora, other important personalities? The late Anahit Derminasyan is an example. Why, I mean, with the history that she has, her achievements and all of that, why hasn't anybody made a documentary about her? I mean, these are perhaps absurd questions, but they are also very relevant questions. So I think that is his command. That's the task he gives us.
By the way, if you want to listen to Anahit Derminasyan's take on Vahé Oshagan, there's a Inalco.
Yeah.
Well, and she's
marvelous.
Yeah, on YouTube there's a conversation available.
Yeah.
Let me add this.
I just remembered her. She just came to my mind. There are others, of course.
Let me add this late breaking question from Alan Whitehorn. Sartre tried to combine Marxism and existentialism. Do we see Oshagan trying to combine nationalism and modernist existentialism?
Probably.
Is he combining them, or are they just existing separate from each other in the same person?
It's a difficult thing for me. It's.
I think Vahe Oshagan. Oh yes, Hrayr. Yes.
I was taken aback when he came after his first visit, because let me put it this way: our experiences are somewhat different in Armenian realities in a way, because Lebanon, as I said, was a lot of it was an identity crisis, and everybody whoever found whatever identity, they were trying to push it on each other, on the other. That you are I'm the real Lebanese, you're not, and still going on. If you go there, that experience for me was not very pleasant. Let me put it, putting it mildly. And in many ways, in many ways, that brand of nationalism is over. So we're looking at another way of looking at, instead of nation state, probably nation culture, or something in that is not necessarily tied to borders and politics. And I don't know, Vahé was, I don't know whether we disagreed or not, but there was that element in him that I was trying to get away from. I think.
You mean in the film?
No, in our conversations, in our personal friendship, he still did see some value in that way of looking at things, and I did not want to look at things from that point of view.
I think, may I? Mark?
Yes, of course.
I think the question for Vahe Oshagan was the question of land. That can language, Western Armenian, yes, Khachik Dergugasyan, can Western Armenian replace the land? The mystique, the function of the land. I think that is the nationalism that is his nationalism. This is why I think it's interesting when he wrote Fatherland about Qarabağ, about Artsakh. What happened? If you read the text carefully, it's almost a mystical understanding of land. So I really think for his diaspora sensibility and mine, and our generation perhaps, or our family, I don't know, land is something made of sand. It's not, it shifts. One day you're in Bulgaria, the next day you're in Jerusalem, the third day you're in Beirut. And so it's not so much the land, but it's something else that he thought could replace the land until he goes to Qarabağ. And then things change.
Yeah. In many ways, I have to come back. I mean, I've been to Armenia only once in 2016 to premiere this version of the film, and I had a difficult time leaving. I kind of found that it's there, and it's so I understand that part. And I understood that part in 2016, not before that. So there is this connection that it's there.
So the last comment is again from Khachik Jallatyan. Khachik Jallatyan, of all people, poses this question. is a deterritorialized nation possible? Is that what the Jewish diaspora was for 1800 years? It's a big question. If anyone would like to say anything about that, I suspect Khachik has plenty to say about that.
Yes. Well, I would like to say a few things. Of course, I wouldn't necessarily speak about my opinion, but I want to again remind or maybe tell our audience that in 1991, Ishvan Jinbashian did an interview with Vahé Oshagan. It was published in the Armenian International Magazine in July 1991, and the magazine is completely available online. It takes a few clicks on Google and you can find the text. And in that text, of which I'm sure Khachik Tololian is very aware, Vahé Oshagan says that with this notion of dispute toward the diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, Armenians have the opportunity to enter into a new phase of existence, which is very different from the half-conscious. I'm somewhat paraphrasing, but almost quoting Vahé Oshagan, half-conscious existence of the Armenian diaspora of the past millennium. So on the one hand, he acknowledges that yes, Armenians have existed in a diasporic manner in the past millennium, since the fall of the Bagratid kingdom, since the fall of Cilicia, the kingdom of Cilicia. But on the other hand, he wants to emphasize the fact that in modern times, with the 20th century, there are new opportunities coming up, a different kind of diaspora. And that's what I think makes his work very exciting. I think you can see what is happening there. On the one hand, he wants to connect with the past, with the millennial diasporic existence of Armenians. On the other hand, he wants to disconnect with that past and to say, we're turning a corner, we're going into a new direction. And this is also this is also about the sort of like the question about combining or not combining. I think it was Vahé Oshagan, Vahé Oshagan's older son, who told me that Vahé Oshagan very self-consciously was totally okay with being contradictory. He had no problems whatsoever of inhabiting contradictions. So I think the word combining is perhaps not quite proper for Vahé Oshagan. It's more like, yes, I can go to Artsakh, I can try to approach this experience in my essay titled Fatherland. But at the same time, I published in 1964 the volume City, which in a very powerful way tries to experiment with diasporic becoming. And in a sense, once he has published the text, he's not the owner. He can go to Taline, he can go to Artsakh or to wherever he wants. It's for us, for its readers, to make diaspora out of it or not, if they want to, basically.
I think Krikor Beledian addresses it says Hagasutun, not Hagasutun, about Vahé Oshagan being an engagé writer versus
in the film.
in the film.
In his comments, I believe, yes. Yeah. Very interesting.
Vahé Oshagan used to say, contradicting yourself is a human right. Notes, Ara Oshagan.
Oshagan, yes.
Who I guess again would know. So that is a good note to end on then, I think, from this deterritorialized panel. To all of you watching, thank you for staying with us throughout this really wonderful discussion. And I thank Hrayr for making the film and for sharing the film with everyone so that it's now available to anyone who wants to see it, and to Taline and Karen for their enlightened contributions to the audience, and of course to Hamaskein for their collaboration on this program. Once again, a big thank you to all of the above, and stay well. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.